So it begins. Well, almost. 14 days from the day this video uploads, and Amazon's The Rings of Prime will finally be released. Finally, we will find out whether it is truly terrible, or kind of or maybe even sort of okay. But whatever it is that we end up getting, I just can't see how it could possibly be great. Considering all the evidence that Amazon has officially shown us, I can't help but believe this show has already squandered its greatest potential. And I don't say that as a hater. I know the show has somehow fostered a seemingly unique amount of ill will, considering no one's seen it yet, which does strike me as a bit of a bizarre marketing strategy, but I'm not qualified to talk about that. What I'm saying is that if the acting is incredible, and if the dialogue is beautifully written, and the sets are exquisite, and the costumes and makeup and everything is entirely on point, it could turn out to be a very half-decent fantasy show, but it cannot be a uniquely mythical piece of storytelling. It cannot be the masterpiece it could have been. And that is because, as far as I know, right at the very beginning of this show's creation process, it was shot right in the foot. It was absolutely crippled before even a single scene was written, and in my opinion, that is entirely because of the ludicrously bad decision to compress the timeline. However, in the interests of not just whining for an entire video, I have taken the liberty of penning an outline of what I think they should have done. What they could have achieved if they embraced Tolkien's timeline, which is found in the books they totally do have the rights to. So, this is my opinion on how Prime's The Rings of Power should have been written. Maya, Gavan, and Mellyn, and welcome to a slightly different type of Tolkien Untangled video. In the future, I have every intention of making a whole series that will break down the entirety of the Second Age in full detail and explore all of what Tolkien wrote on the subject, as I'm currently doing with the First Age. But this is not that. This is just a, hopefully, fun exercise in exploring the potential that the Rings of Power had in the beginning, and how it definitely could have been adapted relatively faithfully while still being an absolutely epic Tolkienian story. And the first thing to say is that Tolkien's Second Age is 3,441 years long. That matters. All the characters and the locations and the storylines are thousands of years older at the end of the age than they were at the beginning. There is growth to the Second Age that cannot be explored if the timeline is overly compressed. For example, Tolkien wrote that Celebrimbor died 1,512 years before Isildur was even born. Elrond and Galadriel are 3,500 years older by the end of the age than they are at the beginning. The Dark Years, in which Sauron gains mastery over southern Middle-earth, they don't last a decade or so, they last over 1,500 years. By compressing that, what they're doing is making Sauron a massively less substantial threat. They're diluting Elrond's character growth. They're making Galadriel 3,500 years younger than she should be in The Lord of the Rings. They're taking mythology and they're turning it into a generic high-budget TV show. And I guess there are two ways for the showrunners to explain how in Season 1 we could possibly have storylines involving both Celebrimbor and Isildur, or how they're describing Númenor as an ancient kingdom but the Rings of Power haven't even been forged yet. Either they can keep the Second Age the length it is, but just kind of try to make us believe that nothing interesting happened until the last few years when Isildur was alive, which is ridiculous, or they could try to tell us that the Second Age is really only a few hundred years long, which is considerably worse than ridiculous. Now, the only official justification I've seen for why this decision was made are these words from the showrunner J.D. Payne. So he said, "If you are true to the exact letter of the law, you are going to be telling a story in which your human characters are dying off every season because you're jumping 200 years in time. Which, with all due respect, Mr. Payne, is the most creatively cowardly thing I have ever heard a supposedly professional writer say. But, before I go on, do let me reiterate that this video is being released 2 weeks before the first episode airs. So if you're watching this in the future, then you may very well have seen the thing that I'm talking about but have not yet seen myself, and so maybe you know that I am completely wrong. Maybe the showrunners have written a time-compressed version of events that's just so creatively brilliant I don't have the imagination to conceive of it. Honestly, that is the best case scenario. That's kind of what I'm hoping for. I would love to make a video next month where I eat humble pie and explain why it was so ingenious of the showrunners to, for example, cram Galadriel and Miriel into a scene together in Season 1, but I just can't see how that's possible. I certainly can't see how it's better than the alternative. But what about legal rights to the source material? That is obviously a very significant part of this discussion, and on the one hand, I guess it is fair enough that they have to make changes if they don't have access to all of Tolkien's writings, although, on the other hand, if all you have the rights to is the Lord of the Rings appendices, then why aren't they making a Third Age show about the histories of Gondor, or Arnor, or Rohan, or the Dwarves of Durin's Folk, or young Aragorn, or any of the many things that the appendices are actually all about? Anyway, for the purposes of this video, I will play by the same rules that the writers are constrained by in terms of rights. So I won't be talking about like the Blue Wizards from the history of Middle-earth or any First Age Silmarillion stuff, but there is one slight caveat. Because, in the words of the showrunners, we have the rights solely to The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and that is it. We do not have the rights to the Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, the history of Middle-earth, or any of those other books. But this is, to an extent, a lie. How do we know it's a lie? Because this was one of the first images the show ever released, and this map contains names of places that are not included anywhere in The Lord of the Rings or its appendices. This map is only found in the Unfinished Tales, which means the show has the rights to at least one page in the Unfinished Tales. And honestly, if you're gonna make a Rings of Power TV show, this is not the best page. My copy of the Unfinished Tales has 415 pages in it, and I reckon one could make an excellent Rings of Power adaptation with just 6.5 of them from one chapter, and then also another 2-page spread later in the same chapter. That's all they need. Well, there is also a chapter on the Gladden Fields, which would be awesome to adapt in the last ever episode, but for the rest of the 5 seasons, those 8 pages are all you need from the Unfinished Tales. Similarly, you don't need much from the Silmarillion. If you have The Lord of the Rings and its appendices, I think all that's really required is 17 pages of the Akala that's absolutely vital, and ideally also 19 pages of a chapter called Of the Rings of Power, which would definitely be helpful when adapting a show called Of the Rings of Power. But that's it. Those handful of pages, and The Lord of the Rings, is all you really need to make a great yet very faithful adaptation of the Second Age. Because the truth is, unlike some other parts of the Legendarium that are, I think, entirely unadaptable in live-action format, for example, the Ainu Lindale, the Second Age kind of adapts itself. If we root through the writings that the showrunners totally do have the rights to, we'll see that the Second Age is fundamentally a trilogy. It is 3 self-contained-ish stories that make up the beginning, middle, and end of one epic story. And we've heard from official sources that the showrunners are planning on creating 5 seasons, which I actually think is the perfect amount. I was tempted to include a 6th season in this breakdown, but I actually think that squeezing all of that final story into Season 5 will give us like a massive Return of the King epic type ending, which might be lost if we dilute it into Seasons 5 and 6. Anyway, as I say, the Second Age is fundamentally a trilogy, and so Seasons 1 and 2, I think, should tell the first part of that story, the story of the elves and of their conflict with Sauron. Then, Seasons 3 and 4, which I'll talk about in my next video, should shift focus to the men of Númenor and tell the tale of their conflict with Sauron, which our elves will feature in, just not as the main characters. And then finally, Season 5 should focus on the alliance of elves and men and their conflict with Sauron. So, without any further ado, this is how I think the first 2 seasons of the Rings of Power TV adaptation should have been written. And if you're watching in the future, let me know how it compares to the adaptation we end up getting. So, Season 1, Episode 1. We begin with a cold opening, a scene featuring nothing more than two characters in dialogue with each other. The first man is a king, and he is incredibly old. Not weak or sick, just astoundingly old. The other man is his absolute opposite, entirely youthful, only just come of age, and looking like someone who has yet to truly begin their adult life. And the topic of the conversation between these two characters should definitely be death and the desire for deathlessness. This should absolutely be the central theme of the show. It is the absolute central theme of The Lord of the Rings, which this show should fundamentally be a prequel to, considering that's 95% of what they have the rights to. And this idea of death and the desire for deathlessness is what should hold the entire story together. Every facet of all 5 seasons should in some way be an exploration of some branch of this theme. Throughout all of Tolkien's writings, we see a desire for things to be timeless or ageless or to be preserved so that they can escape the fading and passing and dying of time. Yet, at the end of all things, this is futile. Passing and fading and dying are inexorable. That is what The Lord of the Rings is about. It's what the Rings of Power are all about, and it's what this show needs to be about, because it needs to have a focus. Anyway, as it goes, this incredibly old king that we meet in the opening scene does have a very healthy relationship with death. He has lived a very, very long life, and now he is choosing to relinquish that life and to enter death voluntarily. And through his dialogue, we see that death is a gift. This isn't sad, it's the way it's meant to be. But the younger guy doesn't yet fully understand. He loves the king, and he just can't see past the fact that when the old man is gone, they will be separated forever. And through the course of this dialogue, we learn that these two men, the super old one and the super young one, are, in fact, twin brothers. They're the same age, but one is the 500-year-old mortal king of Númenor, Elros, and the other is his 500-year-old immortal brother, Elrond. I don't think we need exposition in this scene. It's not a prologue, it's just character-driven dialogue that explores and introduces our central theme. Old King Elros then lays down on his bed. He summons his sons and his grandsons and his great-grandsons to his bedside, and with his brother Elrond standing among them, he peacefully chooses to relinquish his life and die. It is a very bittersweet way to begin a TV show, but bittersweet is what Tolkien is all about. Anyway, the scene should end with Elrond speaking to the sons and heirs of his brother, and recognizing that although none of them will live for the thousands of years that he will live for, their bloodline will continue for those thousands of years, and so he acknowledges that there is a profound link of kinship between himself and the royal line of Númenor, and he will always be a friend to these men. Which, of course, sets up his relationship with Isildur in later seasons, and it also alludes to his relationship with Isildur's heir, Aragorn, many thousands of years after that. It's a hugely important part of the story. But at the end of the scene, Elrond should depart the king's palace and walk through the streets of Númenor's capital, where we see only a very brief glimpse of the city, but what we do see is that it's still in its infancy. Maybe the Argonath-esque statues are only half built. This is not Númenor in its prime. This is young Númenor. Anyway, Elrond gets on a ship, and then he departs the island, and he sails east towards Middle-earth, and then we get our opening credits. And that single opening scene is the only time, I think, that we should see Númenor in all of Seasons 1 and 2. We'll see Númenorians, but Seasons 1 and 2 should fundamentally be about the elves and their stories, which take place in Middle-earth. It should all be told through their eyes and ears. I know there's a temptation to try and include everything, but I really believe we have to resist that. Tolkien didn't write sprawling stories with dozens of different plotlines all happening simultaneously. That's a very Game of Thronesy style of storytelling, which works for that, but not for this. It may not always look that way, but upon close inspection, I would argue that Tolkien was actually very focused. Lord of the Rings really only has two storylines, the story of the ring and the story of the sword. I know there is a bit more to it than that, but everything does fundamentally tie into one of those two stories. So I think this prequel should be focused too. It should focus on the tale of the rings and the tale of the island. But just as Lord of the Rings begins with the ring, and then we only get the sword storyline later, this show should begin with the Rings of Power and the Elves of the North, and then later we can enrich future seasons with an exciting new Númenor storyline. Because, of course, by beginning the entire show with the death of Elros, we are establishing that the first scene takes place in the year 442 of the Second Age, as is written in the Lord of the Rings appendices. Now, after the end of the opening credits, we do need to jump forward in time a little bit, but this time jump shouldn't be something that the writers are afraid of. They should embrace it. I imagine this time jump as some kind of, I don't know, like an orchestral musical montage that introduces our main characters for season 1 and 2 without much need for exposition or really even much dialogue. Showing instead of telling. It's one of the golden rules of storytelling. And the great opportunity that we have here is that 7 of these 8 main characters who should drive the story of the first 2 seasons are immortal. So the fact that this montage skips forward 800 years is a great way of showing who our main characters are and where they've come from by the time that season 1 really gets going. So, who are these 8 main characters? Well, it's a bit of a no-brainer, really. Tolkien gives us absolutely everything we need in The Lord of the Rings. We don't need to make this up. There are 4 most main characters who should drive all the actions of season 1 and 2, and another 4 who will support them in pretty much every episode. Everyone else should be either a supporting character or a recurring character. We don't need 22 lead characters. Anyway, the 4 most important characters are, in no particular order, Elrond, Celebrimbor, Gil-galad, and Galadriel, who are at least all present in the show, so that's something, I guess. The other 4 main characters, who are conspicuously absent from the trailers and promos that I've seen, should definitely be Círdan the Shipwright, Celeborn, husband of Galadriel, Celebrian, daughter of Galadriel, and Durin III, who I will talk more about in just a minute. But before I move on with my proposed plot, I have to talk about the personalities of our 4 most important characters. First, there is of course Elrond, the first character we meet in the entire show. And over the span of this 800-year opening montage, we should see Elrond grow from a 500-year-old elf to a 1300-year-old elf. He should gain some wisdom, probably his hair should grow a bit, and we should see him mature into by far the youngest of our 4 main characters, but a kind of humble presence among them, kind of the heart of the show. However, because we have already explored his most salient characteristic for now in that opening scene, he's probably the least important part of this montage. You know, he's an asset to everyone he interacts with, but he's not yet a particularly independent player. Second of the most major 4 is Celebrimbor, and in a lot of ways he is almost an opposite to Elrond. Most significantly in this montage time jump is that Celebrimbor is not even in the same kingdom as Elrond. Elrond is hanging out in Gil-galad's realm of Lindon, but many miles away, Celebrimbor spends these 800 years building up the incredible elven realm of Eregion all around him. He takes empty Wilderland near the Misty Mountains, and over the span of these 800 years, he turns it into the incredibly awe-inspiring elven realm that he will then be the lord of. And by looking at the realm he spends 800 years building, we should get a glimpse of Celebrimbor's personality. You know, he is a craftsman of exquisite talent, and the beauty of his realm should reflect that. But he is also a little bit prideful. He knows his realm is amazing, and by intercutting some of his scenes with Elrond's, we'll see just how different they are. Whereas Elrond takes delight in things like poetry and music, Celebrimbor is building the greatest realm ever, and decorating it with jewels and silver and gold. Also, dwarves. Celebrimbor has a great friendship with the neighbouring dwarves. He is the one who creates the super iconic Doors of Durin, and through their mutual love of crafting, both Eregion and nearby Khazad-dûm are equally enriched. So we should see a bit of that. Third, we have our main warrior character, our armor-wearing, weapon-wielding, badass royal who spends the 800-year montage hunting evil things, avenging loved ones that maybe died in the First Age, saying things like, "You have not seen what I have seen," and generally demonstrating that although we are currently in a period of peace, it cannot last, and the shadow of the past hangs over everything. And if we look at The Lord of the Rings, we will see that this royal warrior character, the one who can't shake the dread that things are about to go awfully wrong, is, obviously, Gil-galad. That should definitely be Gil-galad's arc. It's astounding to me that Galadriel seems to be the one with this motivation. Considering where we know Gil-galad will end up, and considering where we know he came from, I think a war-scarred warrior living in a time of peace is a fascinating theme to explore, but Gil-galad should be the one to explore it. I mean, just look at the fact that he's so intimately associated with his spear. No other main character gets a named weapon until Elendil comes along, and after Narsil, Iagloss is the most iconic weapon of the entire Second Age. It should be wielded by a warrior. Also, Tolkien doesn't tell us very much about Gil-galad's personality, but he does give us enough details to draw out a really interesting character. What Iagloss means in Sindarin is icicle, or literally snow point, which is a very badass name for a spear that glows blue around orcs, but Iagloss is also the name of a type of flower in Middle-earth, so we get to see two sides to this character. His weapon plays such an important role in his story, yet he chose to name it for a sweet-smelling flower that grew in the lands ruled by his First Age forefathers. Furthermore, from the appendices, we know he is the king of a brand new kingdom. But whereas Elrond's scenes can show us just how beautiful and lovely Lindon is, Gil-galad should be spending these 800 years defending his borders and hunting down any orcs that could potentially be a threat. You don't need the Silmarillion rights to names like Finnegon and Fingolfin to explore the concept of Gil-galad being a young king of the Second Age who is descended from incredibly mythic high kings of the First Age, all of whom died in one-on-one duels with the most powerful villains of that age for the good of their people. Gil-galad survived all that because he was too young to take part in it, and again, we don't need Silmarillion specifics to suggest that maybe Gil-galad has some kind of survivor's guilt. The only reason he is king is because his immortal forefathers gave their lives fighting evil. And Gil-galad's arc over the series should be whether he is worthy of standing among them, whether he will ever be as epic as they are. Which, spoiler alert, by the end of the show, he definitely will be. That's kind of the point of his whole character. And so the final main character for this show should, of course, be Galadriel. And Galadriel isn't the easiest character to adapt. The reason I said I needed those 6 pages from the Unfinished Tales is because that is the only place where Galadriel's Second Age story is given. But, as I talked about in one of my earliest videos actually, I think Galadriel's entire arc, throughout all her different Middle-earth appearances, the thing that really draws her character together, can, to an extent, be summed up as this. Galadriel is a character who spends her entire life navigating the internal conflict between two parts of her psyche, her want and her need. She's all about finding balance between her pride and her wisdom. The whole reason she's even in Middle-earth during the Second Age is because she was offered an opportunity to return west at the end of the First Age, but she refused to take it, out of pride. Her ambition kept her in Middle-earth, but that's not what defines her. Galadriel proves time and time again throughout every era of her life that when the going gets tough, and when she is placed in a position where her true colours really reveal themselves, she is a character who passes tests. Her pride is strong, but her wisdom is stronger. Now, we know one of Galadriel's main wants is to rule as a queen over her own realm, kind of like Celebrimbor. But again, we know from The Lord of the Rings, that's not what's destined to happen. She will never be a queen, but she will go on to become the lady of someone else's realm. That's her need. She'll never be the Queen of Lothlorien. She doesn't build it, but she adopts it. She protects it. She preserves it. She enriches it, kind of like a guardian. But she came to that realm as a guest. Ambition versus wisdom. And this means, I think, Galadriel should be the most psychological protagonist in the entire show, with one of the most thematically rich character arcs. However, I will be the first to admit, this theme is not easy to convey visually within a montage spanning 800 years, so right now, in the first few minutes of the first episode, we should focus on the fact that at the beginning of the Second Age, Galadriel enters a brand new stage of her life. She becomes a mother. At the beginning of this montage, we should see Galadriel and her husband Celeborn with their little baby daughter, Celebrian. And the passing of these 800 years can be visualized by Celebrian's growth. By the end of the montage, she is our youngest elven character, and I think that by focusing on her relative youth, we see a parallel between her character and Elrond's character. You know, the guy she's going to go on to marry. Anyway, the other part of the Galadriel storyline that we should absolutely set up early is that unlike our other elven major characters, the Galadriel, Celeborn, Celebrian triad don't have a realm of their own at this point. They are wanderers, all around the northern lands of Eriador, and although they should obviously share a good deal of screen time with Gil-galad and Celebrimbor in Lindon and Eregion respectively, throughout the series, Galadriel's time as a wandering elf should be thoroughly explored. I think it's the perfect lens through which to explore her fundamental character arc. She is an amazingly powerful Noldo elf, but she's leading a diverse group of dark elves, mostly wood elves and a few Sindar, so not Noldor, that's important. And over the span of Season 1, she spends most of her time guiding them through Middle-earth, looking for the perfect place to build her realm, and uncovering major parts of the story along the way. So, although it doesn't actually need to cover more than a few minutes of screen time, I think that by embracing the 800-year time jump, we have a great opportunity to efficiently introduce and explore our four main characters. And we'll also get to see how the other major characters fit into all this. Celebrian and Celeborn are of course major players in Galadriel's storyline. Círdan the Shipwright is a mentor and sort of avuncular figure for Gil-galad. He is the guy who raised Gil-galad while the rest of his family were off dying in the wars of the First Age. And right at the end of the montage, we can introduce our eighth main character through the perspective of Celebrimbor. Right as the montage ends, we should see his neighbours, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, celebrating the birth of a new baby dwarf. And the reason this baby is auspicious, the reason an elven lord would be invited to whatever the dwarven equivalent of a baptism is because this dwarf baby is considered the third reincarnation of the first dwarf ever, Durin the Deathless. This baby will grow up to be Durin the Third. Which means, by the time this montage ends and our episode 1 properly gets going, we have firmly established that season 1 begins in the year 1200 of the Second Age, and there is nothing that I have just talked about there that an adapter would not have the rights to with just The Lord of the Rings and a few pages from the Unfinished Tales. So, with all that groundwork laid, what actually happens in season 1? Well, I think the story should be very much directed by our four main characters, and by the locations they find themselves in. One storyline should be set in Lindon, and revolve around Gil-galad's concern over a growing threat to his realm, as well as Elrond's growth into Gil-galad's right-hand man, and Círdan's presence as a wise and compassionate counsellor to the king. The second storyline should revolve around Celebrimbor and his friendship with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, and their ambition to use these seemingly unending days of peace to craft the greatest realms in Middle-earth that will forever define the Second Age. And the third storyline should revolve around Galadriel, her metaphorical journey as a mother, her literal journey as a wanderer, and her metaphorical and literal journey as a leader of these wanderers. And if we look at a map, we will see that these three storylines are still really quite focused. Lindon is here, Eregion is here, and Galadriel is wandering Eriador, which is all of this here. So I think this is the only part of Middle-earth that needs to be explored for now. Again, I know there is a temptation to try and make the show about everything, but if there's no focus, it will end up becoming about nothing. However, I guess there is potentially one exception here, and that's a subplot involving the Sindar princes Oropher and Armdir, and their relocation east out of Noldoreen lands into the woods that will one day become Mirkwood and Lothlorien, or if the writers can't get the rights to that 2-page spread in the Unfinished Tales, a very similar subplot involving Thranduil. It won't be immediately relevant, but a storyline involving Sindar royalty heading east to build their own woodland realms where they rule a predominantly Sylvan population will come back in a big way in later seasons. Anyway, after the first 1 or 2 episodes of establishing these characters and their storylines, the main conflict of Season 1 needs to be introduced. I think Gil-galad should spend these episodes growing concerned over rumours of a new shadow rising, whilst Celebrimbor is only looking ahead and assuming that the peace will last forever, the war is long over. But then everything changes when Galadriel and her wandering company journey through the lands of some rustic middlemen just to the south or east of Gil-galad's kingdom. And in their lands she finds indisputable proof that a shadow is indeed returning. Gil-galad isn't paranoid, he's right. Darkness is creeping back into the world, and that darkness is Sauron. Now, I don't think these middlemen need too much screen time. They're mortals, so they aren't going to last, but their community will last. And so in Season 1, we should see from an elven point of view that although these middlemen are generally friendly to Galadriel's wandering company, there is some hidden darkness slowly growing among them. Some evil presence is latching on to these middlemen, and due to Galadriel's wisdom, she is able to perceive it and take some evidence of it back to Gil-galad. Also, I think there's a really fun opportunity here to inject another very Tolkienian theme into the show without having to do a deep dive into things we don't have the rights to. Because, although the showrunners don't need to explicitly state this in the show, they definitely do have to have an answer to this question. Which Middle-earth language is being translated into English? What's the common tongue of this show? In Lord of the Rings, it's Westron, but Westron doesn't exist in the Second Age, which would make things very difficult if we didn't keep a tight focus on the story, but if we do, the answer is obvious. Sindarin. Every single character that I have talked about so far would speak Sindarin as their primary language. Obviously the elves do, but so too do the Númenoreans and even the dwarves, who Tolkien tells us are incredibly protective of their own Khuzdu language, so they would always speak to foreigners in the foreigner's language, which in this case would be Sindarin. However, these middlemen should be the exception. If we look at a map, we will see that they are living near a part of the world that will, in many thousands of years' time, be known as Bree, and the surrounding towns of Arichet, Chetwood, and Combe, all of which, very interestingly, are real-world Celtic names. In most cases, Lord of the Rings has a very Anglo-Saxon vibe to it, but this part of the world is Celtic. And so I think it would be very cool if these middlemen that Galadriel's wandering company encounter speak some fictionalized version of either Welsh or Cornish or some other Celtic language, but the actors shouldn't be speaking English, and I don't think their dialogue should have subtitles, because the elves shouldn't be able to understand this mannish language. It's a cool opportunity for world building, and it's something that J.R.R. Professor of Language Tolkien took very, very seriously. Also, it's something that we can expand upon in Seasons 3, 4, and 5. I've got a plan. Anyway, at the same time that Gil-galad is hunting down the source of this darkness that's spreading just south and east of his borders, we should also meet our 9th main character, probably the only character to play a really central role in every one of the 5 seasons. And that is, of course, Sauron. I've heard rumours that Sauron's not going to appear in the first season of Prime's show. I don't know if that's true or not, but if it is true, that's absolutely absurd. Sauron is the main character of the Second Age. He is crucial to all of it. And there's a lot of story to tell in these 5 seasons, so wasting the first one without introducing Sauron is absolute madness. 5 seasons is not enough seasons to be wasting time on irrelevant storylines while saving, like, the whole point of the show for later. The Rings of Power needs to be filler-free, please, otherwise there won't be time for the good stuff. Anyway, Sauron does not, of course, appear as Sauron, not to the elves, while our major characters are debating what this shadow among the middlemen really means for them. Their lands are visited by a mysterious stranger, the Lord of Gifts, Anatar, an amazingly beautiful, wonderful, extraordinary, angelic being, a Maya of creation, an expert in crafting who comes promising to give all of our main characters exactly what they want. He can promise Elrond the means to preserve these years of peace and to escape the fading effects of time, but due to Elrond's humility and that opening scene with Elros, he knows that death and fading, passing, changing, these aren't things he really ought to be afraid of. And although it's very bittersweet when it happens, Elrond doesn't really have this desire for deathlessness that may define some of the other characters, so he rejects Anatar. Anatar then goes to Gil-galad and promises him the power to vanquish this mysterious enemy that he spent so long searching for. But Gil-galad already has power, and for reasons that we've already spent a few episodes exploring, he doesn't trust this newcomer, so Gil-galad turns him down too. Then Anatar goes to Galadriel, the one with the most potential, and he promises her the power to build her own realm and to rule as the mightiest queen ever to exist in Middle-earth. And I think perhaps Galadriel could be tempted, but we know from the source material that she passes tests. And this should be the first big moment where we see both pride and wisdom at play, but ultimately wisdom wins out, and she rejects Anatar too. Which brings us finally to Celebrimbor. And when Anatar comes to Eregion, promising Celebrimbor that together they can craft his realm into the heart of elvendom on Earth, and with his gifts Celebrimbor can become like a founding father of the Second Age, potentially even its most relevant figure, Celebrimbor decides, yeah, I do want that. So Celebrimbor makes the fateful decision to welcome Anatar into Eregion, and he accepts his gift of Ringlore. So, by the halfway point of Season 1, Anatar and Celebrimbor are working together in Eregion, and Celebrimbor's guild of jewelsmiths, the Gwayathi Myrdain, are beginning to create the most incredible artifacts and jewellery, and Eregion's capital, Ostina-Dhil, is turning into the most incredible-looking city that an Amazon Prime budget could possibly conjure. However, the second major storyline of Season 1 is, of course, Gil-galad and Círdan and Elrond's storyline in Lindon. And I promise this is the only part of the Second Age where I will slightly fudge the timeline, just a tiny bit for the sake of storytelling. Because while Anatar and Celebrimbor are doing their thing in Eregion, in Lindon, and specifically in the Grey Havens where Círdan dwells, Elrond and Círdan welcome a newcomer of their own. Whilst looking west out across the ocean in the direction of far-off Númenor, where his brother's descendants rule as kings, Elrond sees a lone ship approaching. This great but very un-elven-looking ship anchors in the Havens, and for the first time in 800 years, Elrond meets a Númenorian. He and Círdan welcome this Númenorian sailor and his crew, and from them we get a glimpse of what's been happening in Númenor in the 800 years since we last saw it. Now, as I say, this is slightly different to what Tolkien wrote. In the appendices, we're told that a Númenorian prince called Aldarion arrived at the Grey Havens, but he did so in the year 700 of the Second Age, which would mean this happened during the opening montage, and I think this is too important of an event to be glossed over like that. Also, Aldarion is a very important character in the tale of Aldarion and Arendis, but A, we don't have the rights to that, and B, as wonderful as that story is, it's only very tangentially relevant to the story of the Rings of Power, so I would suggest on this one occasion taking inspiration from what Tolkien said about Aldarion in the appendices and using that inspiration to create a very similar storyline that takes place just a few hundred years later. In Tolkien's writings, Aldarion, the heir to the Númenorian throne, arrives at the Grey Havens, and in this adaptation we'll invent a very similar heir to the throne called, let's say, Halbrand. So, Halbrand comes to Lindon, and through his interactions with Elrond, we see a connection form between them. They are kin. As an heir to the throne, Halbrand is a direct descendant of Elros, and the fate of Númenor really matters to Elrond. All Númenorians of royal descent are Elrond's family. Halbrand tells us that although Númenor has grown mighty in the 800 years since that first scene, not everything is perfect. Not everyone in Númenor is on the same page, philosophically. Halbrand can reveal that there are some who didn't want him sailing to Middle-earth, who told him not to seek out the elves, for they aren't to be trusted. There's a jealousy of elves in Númenor, and at the moment it's still very, very subtle, and Halbrand demonstrates that it isn't anywhere near universal. He, and many others, his entire crew, are very much elf friends. But the desire for deathlessness is just beginning to take hold among some Númenorians. Anyway, eventually, Elrond should introduce Halbrand to his king, Gil-galad. And through their dialogue, we'll see that Halbrand and Gil-galad have a lot in common. They both perceive that a shadow is falling on their respective kingdoms, and even though many of their respective people don't agree, both Halbrand and Gil-galad do agree. Something is afoot, and the elves and the Númenorians are going to need each other in the years to come. So, in the Lindon storyline of Season 1, we should focus on the coming of the Númenorians, their time in Lindon, which can be decades if we want it to be, their friendship with the elves of Lindon, and then towards the end of the season, their departure, and their return back across the sea. And as Halbrand leaves Gil-galad towards the end of the season, he can have aged a bit since we first met him, but we should also see that he and Gil-galad and Elrond and his crew have built a powerful friendship. They really trust each other, but Halbrand leaves Middle-earth on a note of uncertainty. He doesn't know what Númenor will be like when he returns, and he doesn't know if he'll ever be able to come back. He doesn't know if his descendants will continue this friendship with Gil-galad after his death, or whether their desire for deathlessness will ultimately turn his people against the elves. But once again, it is death and deathlessness that are fundamentally being explored here. And so, towards the end of Season 1, we have our final time jump. Gil-galad spends 300 years waiting for the return of the Númenorians, and any word of Halbrand's descendants, but no one ever comes back. It's all a bit of a mystery. However, the reason that I think there has to be another time jump here is because it's a massively important part of a different Season 1 storyline. Tolkien tells us, again in the appendices, that Annatar spent 300 years in Eregion with Celebrimbor, and I really don't think this should be compressed. It can be quite swiftly, jumped through, we don't need to spend a whole season showing it, but it should happen. 300 years of Celebrimbor and Annatar working together in Eregion is a big deal. Annatar has a huge influence that lasts a really long time, and things change in those 300 years. I think we can visually illustrate the passage of time here by showing the aging of our only mortal main character, Durin III. While Celebrimbor and Annatar are doing their thing, Durin III goes from a very young dwarf to a great dwarven king in his prime. Also, our Mannish community that Galadriel encountered at the beginning can grow too. Individuals will have died, but their buildings, their fields, their homes, that can all move forward with the timeline. And speaking of Galadriel, she needs a Season 1 storyline too, and it's not too difficult to find that if we just look at her character and where we know she's going to go in future seasons. As I said, Galadriel is fundamentally a wandering elf during this period, but there are two locations that we specifically see her going back and forth between multiple times throughout these years. First is Eregion, where we know she spends a good amount of time with Celebrimbor, her first cousin once removed. But she also spends a good deal of time on the other side of the Misty Mountains, where she and Celebrian and her wandering company stumble upon the sylvan woodland of Lindorinan, which will of course go on to be known as Lothlorien. Now, if we have the rights to that Amdir storyline, we can have a really cool interaction between him and Galadriel. If not, it's not the end of the world. What we really need to explore here is Galadriel's relationship with the local wood elves, and how she is setting the foundations for one day becoming the lady of this golden wood. Also, there is an excellent opportunity to expand upon the dwarves of Khazad-dûm in this storyline. Again, it's insane that the actual show seems to be using Elrond as our elven eyes and ears in Khazad-dûm when it so obviously should be either Galadriel or, to be fair, maybe Celebrimbor, but definitely not Elrond. In order to travel between Eregion and Númenoreans, Galadriel and her elves must pass all the way through Khazad-dûm. So, through maybe Celebrian's youthful perspective, we can explore Khazad-dûm in its prime, and illustrate a fun little prequel to that exact same journey that the Fellowship will also make thousands of years later. Also, this is going to set up a major Season 2 storyline. But it's not just about plot. I really think Galadriel's back and forth between the epic Noldoreen kingdom of Eregion and the quiet sylvan community of Númenoreans is a great example of Galadriel's pride and wisdom at play. On the one hand, she has an ambition to be with Celebrimbor in Eregion, where it's all happening, and yet her wisdom is telling her that actually the more humble, rustic community in the east is where she will eventually be needed. Anyway, I'll finish this Season 1 breakdown with the Eregion storyline. Over the span of this 300-year time jump, we should see that Celebrimbor has spent centuries studying under the tutelage of Annatar. So, by the last few episodes, we are finally ready to forge the Rings of Power. Celebrimbor and Annatar do this together, but as the season begins to draw to a close, Annatar should mysteriously depart Eregion, and during his absence, I think we can see Celebrimbor taking counsel with Galadriel and deciding to forge 3 rings of his own in secret. This he does, and thus the Elven rings are created. But then, in the finale, the truth is revealed. When Annatar left Eregion, he returned to his homeland, but first he went back via that community of middlemen that Galadriel met earlier in the season. And some of these middlemen worship Annatar in a not particularly positive way. The gift he promises them is the gift of deathlessness. Anyway, Annatar's homeland turns out to be, of course, Mordor. In the fires of Mount Doom, Annatar forges for himself a ruling ring, and any casual fans who hadn't figured it out yet will learn that Annatar is indeed Sauron. And when he puts the ruling ring onto his finger, our main characters sense his presence, and they learn this too. So, as Season 1 ends, Gil-galad suddenly becomes aware that this darkness, the source of the evil he's been hunting all season long, is Annatar. The guy who's been living openly in Eregion for 300 years. The shadow that worked its evil among the middlemen has also worked evil among the elves, and Celebrimbor is right at the center of this. I think the final scene of the first season should be Celebrimbor in Eregion with his 3 elven rings and the 16 that he and Sauron made together. And while staring at these rings, he realizes the extent to which he's been deceived. He realizes that he was wrong. The days of peace are well and truly over. He realizes the Dark Lord will be wanting these rings back, and war is on its way north. Sauron is coming for Celebrimbor. And that is the end of Season 1. If each season were to have a subtitle, I think I'd call this one something like The Lord of Gifts. The purpose of Season 1, obviously, is to introduce our elven heroes and tell the first half of the first part of the Second Age trilogy. Which means in Season 2, we don't have to waste time with Preamble. Season 2 of the Rings of Power should really only have one thing to revolve around, and that is war. Once again, I think it's important to keep focus. If a storyline isn't relevant to the War of the Elves and Sauron, it doesn't really matter how interesting it is, it shouldn't feature in Season 2. All of the drama should be drawn out of the actions and the desires and personalities of our 4 most major characters. Although, in Season 2, we can also expand a little bit on those other 4 characters, Celeborn, Celebrian, Durin III, and Círdan, as well as, of course, on Sauron himself, who will come across very differently in Season 2. No longer is he Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. Now we get to see Sauron in his element. Sauron Unleashed, the Dark Lord openly revealed and declaring war on the mightiest elves in Middle-earth. And the other really great thing about Season 2 is that it should be really quite easy to adapt. If you have those 6 pages in Unfinished Tales, as well as a decent understanding of Middle-earth geography and just what makes our characters tick, then you have everything you need to create an awesome Season 2. It's already right there in Tolkien's writings. And, unlike Season 1, this doesn't even have to span a particularly long time. The entirety of Season 2 should take place between the years 1693 and 1701. That's only 8 years. And honestly, compressing 8 years into a single narrative is nowhere near as offensive as compressing 3,500 years. Anyway, this season should begin in Eregion, with Celebrimbor preparing for Sauron's coming and realizing that he can't keep his 3 elven rings. No matter what, Sauron must never get his hands on them. They are the only rings that are free of his will. So, he gives Nenya to Galadriel, and he sends Vilya and Narya to Lindon to be born by Gil-galad and Círdan, respectively. Episode 1 can focus on the looming threat of war and the deep breath before the plunge, but by Episode 2, I think Sauron should be well on his way into the north. The first people in the story that he would interact with, just geographically speaking, would be those middlemen from Season 1. And we should see that this is the beginning of what will become one of Sauron's most defining characteristics. He is phenomenally talented at deceiving men and convincing them to act against their own best interests. And so, as Season 2 gets going, Sauron approaches Eriador, war descends upon all our major characters, and the elven realms we've been focusing on begin to face its devastating consequences. Every one of our 9 main characters will have a very different perspective on the war, and through their perspectives we can explore a really rich variety of themes all pertaining to war. You know, something I don't have to remind you Tolkien himself was far too familiar with. So, obviously, Gil-galad is our main warrior character, and although Tolkien tells us almost nothing about his actions during this war, it's really not difficult to explore the theme of war through the lens of a warrior. You know, this isn't challenging stuff to respectfully invent. Cinematic battle sequences work a lot better on screen than they do in books, so I guess this would be the opportunity for some action scenes, if that's what the creators are going for. And Gil-galad is defending his realm from the enemy that he spent centuries trying to hunt down, so this is a personal war for him. It's personal for Celebrimbor too, but in a very different way. And, of course, Gil-galad's second in command is his mentor, Círdan the Shipwright, who doesn't really have what we'd think of as a warrior's personality, but we know he will fight once again as Gil-galad's second in command during the War of the Last Alliance, so I guess this is setting up that. And, of course, the third major player in the Lindon storyline is Elrond. And whereas in Season 1, Elrond was never too far from Gil-galad's side, in Season 2, Elrond is going to have to be forced to stand on his own 2 feet. In keeping with Tolkien's writings, Elrond should be sent off with his own faction of warriors to help reinforce Celebrimbor in Eregion, which is a great opportunity to explore who Elrond is growing into, and what he does when he's forced to take on a leadership role in a life or death situation. He travels off to war, and spoiler, he will not go back to living in Lindon. However, I feel that the main focus, certainly for the first half of Season 2, should be in Eregion with Celebrimbor. As Sauron draws nearer, Celebrimbor should prepare his realm for a massive battle, and in so doing he should send the non-combatants away from his realm to some place where they'll hopefully be safe. And this, I think, should be what Galadriel's storyline is all about in Season 2. Tolkien tells us she didn't fight in the War of the Elves and Sauron, but there is a lot more to war than fighting. There is a human cost, there are refugees, there is forced migration, people are displaced, homes are lost, and I think Galadriel is the perfect character to explore this more profound side of war. No longer is she wandering due to prideful ambition or due to the desire to build her own kingdom. In Season 2, Galadriel is wandering because she has a company of refugees under her care. It is her duty to lead these non-combatants away from Eregion, through Khazad-dûm, and into the Sylvan forests of the east. And, of course, she's not just protecting people, is she? She's also protecting Nenya, her ring of power. She can't wear it, but she has to guard it. So, although Guardian Galadriel might not be quite as flashy as, like, Warrior Princess Galadriel, A, it's closer to what Tolkien wrote, and B, I actually think it's a much more interesting direction to take such a psychological character, who we know is destined to grow into the Lady of the Golden Wood that we'll meet in Lord of the Rings. Also, there is a great opportunity here to expand on Celebrian's character. She is so young by elven standards, she has never known any kind of conflict before, and yet now she is thrust into a devastating war. And, in the absence of her father, Celebrian is also Galadriel's second-in-command. Just like Elrond, Celebrian should spend Season 2 growing from an observer in another character's story to an active participant in the resistance of evil and the protection of her mother's people. Now, I just said Celebrian is doing this in the absence of her father, and that is because, in Tolkien's writings, Celeborn does not join his wife and his daughter in the east. He stays with Celebrimbor in Eregion, and he fights in this battle for Eregion. Celeborn is quite different from most other major elves we've met so far, and that is because he is not one of the Noldor. He's a Sindar. But by this point, he is the mightiest of all Sindar left in Middle-earth, so we should really explore that. And Warrior Celeborn isn't something I'm inventing. We know from the appendices that during Lord of the Rings, Celeborn fights 3 battles in the defense of Lothlorien at around the same time the Battle of Pelennor Fields is happening in Gondor. And so, just past the halfway point of Season 2, I think we should have a whole episode focusing on the devastating Fall of Eregion. There's an awful lot to say about this, but by focusing on our 4 major characters here, Celebrimbor, Celeborn, Durin III, and Elrond, the sack of Eregion can be really epically told without straying too far from the admittedly limited available source material. Now, I'm not going to explain this battle right now, but by the end of this game-changing episode, Celebrimbor will be dead. Eregion will be in ruins, and Durin III will have retreated back to Khazad-dûm, where the doors of Durin are shut, and the years of prosperity between elves and dwarves are ended. However, before that, the dwarves fight an epic last stand, which gives Elrond and Celeborn and the surviving elves of Eregion the opportunity they need to escape into the north. And although the death of Durin III isn't anywhere stated by Tolkien, considering that this whole series should be about death and the desire for deathlessness, I think it would be nice to maybe have Durin accept death in this battle, pass his ring of power onto an heir. Celebrimbor giving him a ring of power is included in the appendices, so they do have the rights to that. But then Durin could potentially die in this battle. But I think he should die with the belief that one day he will be reincarnated again as Durin IV. For, according to the customs of the Longbeards, all Durins are Durin the Deathless. So by giving this character closure, we get yet another exploration of that dichotomy between death and deathlessness. Anyway, after the sack of Eregion, Elrond and Celeborn flee into the wilds of the north, and while retreating, they stumble upon a hidden valley where they take refuge. And together, they slowly begin the construction of what will one day grow into Rivendell. Although, for the purposes of the show, it should only ever be referred to as Imladris. Now, I know I'm moving very quickly here, this is turning into a stupidly long video, but as the end of Season 2 approaches, we have Gil-galad and Círdan and the Elves of Lindon desperately trying to fight back the rising tide of Sauron, but his numbers are just too great. Because we didn't mess around with the timeline in Season 1, we know that Sauron has spent over 1,000 years building this army and preparing for this war, and just as Tolkien wrote, after a few years, all of Eriador is overrun. Gil-galad fights and fights and fights, but he knows Eregion has fallen. He has every reason to believe that his protege Elrond is dead too, he's missing in action, and so we get to explore the psyche of a warrior facing what he believes is the end, ultimate defeat. But right as the season finale is nearing, and Gil-galad's army is pushed all the way back to the western coast of Lindon, and all seems truly lost, Gil-galad looks west, and he discovers that a fleet of Númenorian warships are sailing right towards Círdan's havens. When they make land, we find out that their captain is some descendant of Halbrand's. Let's say it's his grandson. And although we've not seen Númenorians all season, we finally get to learn what's happened in those 300 years since Halbrand departed Middle-earth at the end of Season 1. I think, for the sake of exploring themes, Halbrand should be dead now, but this new captain of the Númenorians, his grandson, tells Gil-galad that because of the friendship that he made with Halbrand back in Season 1, and because of the stories that Halbrand brought back to Númenor, the stories these younger Númenorians have grown up listening to, they were inspired to sail to war and to aid the elves in their great conflict with Sauron. This is the first sliver of what will grow into the last alliance. And, exactly as is described by Tolkien, the Númenorians and Gil-galad's Noldor now have the strength to obliterate Sauron's armies, which they do, and Sauron is driven out of the north and he retreats back to Mordor, while his army is absolutely destroyed. Which means that Season 2 ends on the bittersweet note of the war was won, but at a devastating cost. Part 1 of the Second Age trilogy is over. The rings are forged, but the elf kingdoms of the north are now crippled. The middlemen, who were once generally friendly to Galadriel's wandering company, are now highly distrustful of all elves, and their community has been permanently tainted by Sauron's influence. And even among the Númenorians, all is far from perfect. Halbrand's grandson saved the day, but he shouldn't be quite as friendly to Gil-galad as Halbrand was. We see conflict here, jealousy. This new heir to the Númenorian throne doesn't like that elves get to be free of death while men don't. Once again, death and deathlessness are making things difficult, which will be pivotal in setting up Season 3. Speaking of setting up Season 3, I think Season 2 needs to include one final scene from the perspective of our main villain, Sauron. In this scene, he once again puts on a fair form and he goes abroad, visiting communities of dwarves and men all around Middle-earth and dividing the 16 rings of power into the 7 and the 9. Or the 6 and the 9, depending on whether Celebrimbor gave Durin a ring or not. But I also think there should be a specific focus on 3 of the men that Sauron gifts rings to, because these 3 men are lords of Númenor. He should encounter them, I think, in a newly built Númenorian colony somewhere in Middle-earth. It's a bit law-breaking to have Sauron travel to Númenor this early on. Also, Númenorian colonies are going to be an important part of next season. But of course, all 3 of these Númenorian lords are destined to slowly grow into the Nazgul. And one of them is almost certainly the mortal man who will grow into the Lord of the Nazgul, the Witch King. This will all get thoroughly explored in Season 3. Anyway, towards the end of the last episode of Season 2, we should see Gil-galad and Elrond reunited in Imladris, and Gil-galad should give his ring, Vilya, to Elrond, on the understanding that Gil-galad is a warrior, and it's not unlikely that he might die in battle. The ring is not safe in his possession, but now Elrond has this safe haven, this refuge of Imladris, and Gil-galad instructs him to stay here, to build it, and to keep the Ring of Power safe. Imladris is kind of the consolation prize for the loss of Eregion. It's nowhere near as awe-inspiring, but awe-inspiring is not what we need going forward. What we need is safe and secret. And by the end of Season 2, Elrond has become the master of that. The second ring, Narya, remains safely with Círdan in the Grey Havens, but in Lindon, Gil-galad finds himself now the king of a greatly reduced realm. And despite his victory, Lindon cannot go back to having peace. Sauron was beaten, but he's still out there. And although Gil-galad has the military might to defend Lindon, he does not have the strength to challenge Sauron. Not yet. So he prepares, and he prepares, and he prepares for the day when he will face Sauron again. And finally, with the war over, Galadriel can now return to Eriador and be reunited with Celeborn, but the refugees of Eregion who followed her to the Golden Wood now have nowhere to go. So they remain with Galadriel. She unites the elves who have nothing else, and she becomes their lady, their leader. And as Season 2 draws to a close, Galadriel, Celeborn, and Celebrian all depart with them, away from the smoking ruins of Eriador in search of a new home. And around Galadriel's neck, she bears the third ring of power, Nenya, which she will guard for the rest of her time in Middle-earth. Now, there's a ton of stuff that I didn't talk about that should be included in Season 1 and 2, but for the sake of giving an overview, those are, I think, the main plot and character and emotional beats that Part 1 of a Second Age trilogy should really be hitting on the head. And I hope you'll agree with me, this story does not need a Hobbit storyline. We don't need to see a Balrog. We don't need a forbidden elf-man relationship, because none of that is relevant to this part of the story. Which is absolutely not to say that TV adaptation can't invent any new characters or storylines, it has to. But everything they do invent should really only exist to expand upon and enrich the main story that's being told. You know, if you want a rustic young woodland character with an elvish name, you don't need to create a whole side story about Harfoots and a guy in a meteor. You could just have Eleanor be one of the Sylvan elves in Galadriel's company. If you want to invent a new dwarf, cool, but keep it relevant to the dwarven storyline that matters. Now, if I'm being honest, when I first decided to make this video, I thought it would be like a 25-minute long thing and I'd be able to breeze through all 5 seasons really quickly. Clearly, that is not the case. I'm not great at making short videos. So I will end this one here. But if you want me to, I will release another video next week where I'll talk all about how I think Seasons 3, 4, and 5 should be adapted, and how the focus of these seasons should shift from the elves of Middle-earth to the men of Númenor, and how Season 3 and 4 will set up the eventual coming together of elves and men in Season 5, the War of the Last Alliance. So, to make sure you don't miss that, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and click like and share this video with your friends if you want to. However, until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and navaer mellyn.